Thanks very much. Thanks, Ellie and Alex, for the invitation. It's my honor. So I'm interested in understanding why the human brain evolved, and I'm going to be using a modeling approach, as Alex just mentioned. And the first thing I want to point out is this pattern that we have in human brain size evolution, and it's the massive expansion of the human brain size. So we have that over the last few million years. For instance, the lineage that we have here had a major brain expansion. For instance, had a brain size that was a little bit over 2 times larger than expected for their body size, just a little bit larger than the brain size that you see in chimpanzees now. And then there was a massive expansion, so that sapiens have now a brain size that's over 5 times larger than expected for our body size. So the first question to ask here is, does it matter? Does it matter that we had this brain expansion? Well, Rob was making the argument that it doesn't, but I'm going to suggest that there are reasons to think that it does. And the point here was already touched upon by Rob, and it is there's a correlation between brain size and number of neurons, and that is actually something that seems to have a very important role, as found here in artificial neural networks. We see that in the last few decades, there's been an increase in the sizes of the artificial neural networks that we have, and we have increased numbers of parameters. That's essentially relating to synapses. It relates to the number of neurons that these models have. And just by doing that, and this is a causal effect, so just by increasing the sizes of these neural networks, you have a massive increase in the performance of these tests. So this is measured as, this is a common measure for how well these models perform, how well they do across 57 different subjects: law, mathematics, science, and we see that as you increase the sizes of these models, there is a response there. And it turns out that over the last few years, these models actually don't publish that information anymore. They don't say how many neurons are involved in these models, because it's such an important quantity that it's actually a trademark. It's actually something that they want not to release, and it's precisely because it matters. So if you agree with that point, then the next question to ask is why did that happen? Why did human brain expansion happen? I'm going to fall here. Of course, there's a lot of hypotheses. We've seen some of that already today. A lot of the times emphasize 3 different areas: so ecological challenges, social challenges, or the fact that you have to consider also cultural aspects for human and other species that undergo social learning. And the standard approach in which these hypotheses are tested is by looking at correlations. That's been sort of a gold standard in the field for decades now. The approach is to look at, for example, a proxy variable that is thought to relate to the hypothesis, for example, group size, for the social brain hypothesis, and then if there is a correlation between group size and neocortex or whole brain, then that's taken as supporting that hypothesis. Or if it's not found, it's interpreted as not supporting that hypothesis. And I'm going to make the case that, well, that's actually not necessarily the case. I'm going to suggest that correlations here doesn't necessarily imply selection. And I'm going to show some results that support that. And also, I'm going to make the point here that the predictions that sometimes are drawn from the hypothesis, for example, that then there should be a correlation between group size and neocortex. It doesn't actually necessarily follow from the hypothesis that's underlying, because you were using this verbal sort of reasoning that may be unreliable. So I'm going to argue that we should probably try to be using some mathematical modeling to try to draw the predictions that we are interested in testing. So the fact that this has been the standard is basically because we haven't had really research tools to address the question, especially if you want to study humans, as Alex Rosario was just mentioning. We have an N of 1 for humans. If we want to understand human brain size evolution, well, we're really out of tools, basically, because the research tools that have been put together in evolutionary biology rely on comparisons, comparative biology. But that's not necessarily the way it has to be. So I'm going to suggest there are other ways to try to approach the problem. So I'm going to describe a little bit how that could be done with another approach. And I'm going to take you to a journey to physics. So let me just go to that. So I'm going to try to borrow ideas from that field here. And let's say you're not interested in brain size evolution, but you're going to be wondering why is there day and night? And so you're living 2,000 years ago, and you're wondering about that. And well, someone living in Egypt, Ptolemy, came up with an idea. Well, then maybe that's because the sun rotates around the Earth, and then that explains why we have day and night. And that's consistent with the evidence at hand. You see that the sun is just doing that, and that seems to work. Later on, Copernicus said, well, no, actually, that may not be the case. It's actually the Earth that rotates around the sun. And later on, Galileo had telescopes and collected some other data that supported that. And actually, the other planets were rotating around the sun. Later on, Kepler said, okay, no, it's not circles, it's actually ellipses. And he came up with some equations that described those ellipses. But these equations are, again, descriptive. There were no mechanistic models to explain why you would have those trajectories around the sun. You're just describing things. Now, it was only Newton later that he came up with his laws of motion and gravitation that suggested a mechanistic model that he described with equations. He said there were forces of there was a force of gravitation, pulled planets, pulled big masses together. And from there, using his law of gravitation and his equations, he derived the ellipses that Kepler said were the trajectories of the planet followed. So he had his mathematical mechanistic model to obtain the predicted trajectories that we observe. From Newton's law, we also can predict this funny motion that we see here. Sort of the ellipse moves, rotates, and that's because of the gravity that other planets exert. And then there's that rotation. It's called precession. And that turns out that actually Newton does a poor job at predicting. He doesn't predict that movement well. So it was only after Einstein came up with his general relativity that he said, well, actually gravity is not a force, it's actually just a fictitious force. It arises because of the curvature of space-time. And that gave rise to his equations that turned out to predict that precession much better. So he had a different mechanistic model that he described with equations, and actually just by choosing the one that better predicts the trajectories observed, well, we pick the one that matches the data better. So that is suggesting an approach here. So we have an N of 1 as well, so we have just one solar system that we're looking at, and it's a similar approach that we will have here, an N of 1 for Homo sapiens. The first thing that is taking these approaches, well, we have to pick the trajectories to explain. So here we just have the trajectories of the planets. I'm going to pick some trajectories later on for what we could try to pick here. The second step would be to formulate mechanistic models like the way Newton or Einstein did, and from those models we predict the trajectories, and then we test those trajectories and see how well those match the data that we have, which is going to be observational. We have just an N of 1 that we're not going to be able to manipulate. And then if we have multiple models, then we can just pick the one that best explains those trajectories. Okay, so the first step, the trajectories. We need to decide what trajectories we want to explain. So I'm going to pick two types of trajectories. The evolutionary trajectory that I was mentioning. It's a big expansion in brain size that we see here in this lineage. And then I'm going to pick a developmental trajectory. Here is the development of brain size for Homo sapiens over the lifespan of the individuals. And this is for chimpanzees. This is the difference between males and females. So I'm going to pick those two trajectories, and I'm going to try to come up with a mechanistic model that can try to generate those trajectories. So we did that. We put together a mechanistic model that could try to do that. And I'm just going to give an overview of what it does. Basically, what we do is we assume a population of individuals, only females, just to make things simple. And each individual has a body that's composed of tissues. So there's a brain tissue. There's follicle, ovarian follicles that the female has, and then the rest of the body that we call just somatic tissue. And at any time, each of the tissues is burning energy. Then we assume conservation of energy, the way physics do, and then assume that some of the energy that the follicles are burning is due to the production and maintenance of offspring. So basically, we're transforming the energy in morphology to energy into a function. So we're sort of doing a conservation of energy reasoning to translate form to function. And the same, some of the energy that the brain is consuming is due to learning and memory, so to the production and maintenance of skills, or cognitive abilities, if you want. And then these skills allow the individual to overcome challenges of different types. So, for example, the individual may have to forage on her own to obtain food, may have to process food, or may have to light a fire. She may have to cooperate with other individuals to say, hunt a big animal, or she may have to compete with another individual to obtain food. Then by overcoming these different types of problems, she obtains energy that she can then allocate to the growth or maintenance of the different tissues that she has. So the evolutionary question then is, how much energy should, after evolution, should this individual allocate to the growth of the different tissues? So how much should she invest into growing the brain, given that she, that is going to allow her to have some skills that obtain energy, and then she can allocate that energy back. So something that's key is that this actually can be parameterized, so we can feed the model with the metabolic costs of the brain. That's been thought to be a key reason for not evolving a large brain. It's very metabolically expensive, so we can feed the model with that and see what happens. Now, I wanted to make predictions about not only the evolutionary trajectory, but also the developmental trajectory I was mentioning. But I was short out of tools to do that. Turns out that the mathematical machinery that we have in evolutionary biology has ignored development for 100 years now. So Fisher came up with a synthesis of genetics and selection, and it's now called quantitative genetics. But basically, he did that at the expense of development. Basically, you have a regression between phenotype and genotype, and that's the description of development in quantitative genetics. But then we don't know what that regression coefficient is. We don't know how it evolves, how it's actually constructed or ontogeny. So there was no way that it could have predicted the evolution of the developmental trajectory with that approach. So I put together a different approach that actually allows me to look at that developmental trajectory, called that evo dynamics, and it's been published recently, and it now allows me to look at sort of the two trajectories, evolution and development. It makes a lot of predictions that are sort of non-standard, because we've been sort of focused on this approach that sort of ignores development so far. So, and it's interesting, but I won't go into the details of that. But you can have a look at these papers. Okay, so with those tools, then I could actually now model the two bits that I wanted, so the evolution and the development of brain size here. And I'm just going to start by looking at the things that this model produces. So here, I'm letting the model run for different parameter combinations. I'm going to explain what these bits mean. This is the adult brain size. This is the adult body size in red. And the squares are the values observed in 7 different hominins. The circles are the values predicted by the model. So for example, if I let the model run, where the individuals are facing 90% of the time, they're solving cooperative challenges, so that they're basically cooperating to obtain food. 10% of the time they're competing with another group. Then, and also if they have this bit I call the sort of strongly diminishing returns of learning, that's a bit of a mouthful. It's just to say that when the individuals are very skilled, they basically stop being able to extract food from the environment. As opposed to being like this. You can be very skilled, but you can continue to be increasingly good at obtaining energy. And my suggestion is that these might arise as a result of cumulative culture. Basically, you can continue to learn from others and become increasingly better at obtaining food without plateauing that much as seen here. Okay, so basically what we have is if I let the model run under this condition, then I obtain a pretty good match with the evolution of brain sizes and body sizes seen in afferences, and I can continue to change things and obtain a pretty good match with a number of other hominins here. So looking at this pie chart, what you see basically is that what's causing actually brain expansion over these lineages is sort of a tendency to increase the brown bit, so the proportion of ecological challenges. So it's sort of like it's a key element there, and also a transition from these strongly diminishing to weakly diminishing returns of learning, so perhaps as an emergence of culture, a cumulative culture there. Okay, so now we can start looking at the bits that I wanted to look at, sort of the evolutionary trajectories and the developmental trajectories. So I'm going to let the model run. So this is going to be a video where this is going to show here. So this is going to be the evolutionary trajectories, adult brain size, body size. The squares are the observed values for a number of different hominins. And the model is going to start here. And I'm going to let it run first under the parameter values that yield afarensis brain sizes. And then I'm going to change parameter values that yield the sapiens brain sizes. So here we go. So it starts and it converges around here. So these are the small brain hominins, the Australopithecines. So this is afarensis, these are Paranthropus. And then after I change parameter values to the hominins, it moves from habilis right here, and then it converges to the brain sizes of Homo sapiens here. So we see that the evolutionary trajectory that is suggested by the squares is somehow approached by the one that's predicted by the model. So we're able to do that test that I was suggesting with an n of 1. So we have the predicted trajectory and somehow a reasonably good match between that one and the observed trajectory. Now let's look at the developmental trajectory, and that's what's shown all over here. So we have the blue lines are the predicted trajectories from the model. The squares are the observed trajectories in an average human female, and the triangles are for a chimpanzee. Human chimpanzee, the squares are for an afarensis. So this is at this point. So this is where the model is going to start. So we see a reasonably decent match with what seems to be the case here for afarensis, and this is okay. But brain size, body size, follicle count, which is a key element here in the model, and the skill level of the individual, which we can track in the model. And I'm going to start. So things start moving around here, and they approach a little bit sort of the Australopithecine brain size. Brain size converges here to the Australopithecine brain size. And then we can change the parameter values to these here, and then we see this massive increase in brain size, also in body size, and an evolution here of a childhood period where there is no reproduction, no follicle production. Adolescence where there is some, and actually there's growth also in somatic body size as observed, and then there's adulthood. So we see this evolution of all these things that we usually think of as being neatly sort of selected. Selection basically has always been thought as, okay, it's selected for a period of childhood, a pre-adolescent growth spurt, a massive brain, and so on. But here it turns out that it's actually not resulting because of any of that. So we can start looking at why that actually happened. So it turns out that we can look at that. So we can look at what's being under selection. What's under selection right here. So there is no direct selection for brain size. There is no direct selection for somatic tissue or for the skill level. So that actually, the only thing that's under selection is the follicle count. And that's as plain selection as you can imagine. The only reason it decreases is because fewer individuals survive to older ages, and that's just a pretty standard thing. So what's actually driving brain expansion is the correlation, the genetic correlation between follicle count and brain size, which is actually just shown here. So these colors are just giving the genetic correlation between brain size and follicle counts at different ages. So the yellow areas is where it's really positive. There's a positive genetic correlation. That yellow area is really what's pushing the brain expansion in this model. And the reason that you have that yellow area pushing for brain size expansion is really what we saw earlier, that you needed ecology and cumulative culture there. So the role of ecology and culture here is not to increase selection for skill level or brain expansion, but to generate the genetic variation between follicle count and brain size that causes brain expansion. And all the other patterns as well, so the childhood period, adolescence period, and adulthood period with direct timing. So that means that basically what this is suggesting is that brain size, at least in this model, is Spandrel, understood as a side effect of another purpose. If you recall, Gould and Lewontin introduced that idea of a Spandrel to evolutionary biology, where, so for example, here in a basilica in Italy, you have an arch that's the objective of the architect. So the architect wants to build an arch and maybe another arch here. And as a secondary effect of that, you end up having this triangular structure between the arches that wasn't really the intended outcome, but ended up being used to produce this very beautiful painting that actually made you think that, well, this probably you would have thought, well, that was what you wanted to do, and yeah, but according to Gödel Lowenstein, that wasn't really necessarily the case. Well, that's what's going on in the model as well. We see that the arch is actually just follicle count. That's what selection is really going for, and everything else is really just a spandrel. And Gould doesn't seem to have had that in mind for brain size. He did suggest that human brain size would have a lot of spandrels because it's such a complex organ, but he didn't seem to have suggested that brain size itself would have been a spandrel, as opposed to what we're finding here. Now, there's a paper by Barbara Findlay and colleagues in behavioral brain sciences a few years ago that made the case that human isocortex would be a spandrel, and they were sort of analyzing some brain allometries that suggested to them that was the case. And so we're converging to that idea here, but for other reasons. And I just want to point out a couple of ideas that emerged on that discussion, on that targets review. And basically, Rilling makes the point here that basically we don't know what's an arch or what's a spandrel, and all we can do basically is to look at departures from allometry that reveal what brain regions and behavioral cognitive abilities were the focus of selection. And what we see here in the model is that, well, we know what's an arch and we know what's a spandrel. And it turns out that we get these departures from allometries that are not because of selection on brain or body sizes. Again, they're just spandrel. So if you see these forms of directional selection, according to the model, they may not be the result of selection for those directional, for the directional selection observed. Now, a number of other people responding to Findlay and colleagues just found the idea implausible. They just thought, well, that this doesn't make sense. I mean, and it's such a complex organ that just being a side effect is just nonsense. Well, I'm going to make the point there that borrowing ideas from physics, well, plausibility is not really a good criterion to reject or accept hypothesis. We have a poor intuition to especially when things are complex. And the idea would be actually to use a mathematical model, the way that Newton or Einstein did, to make predictions and see how well they match the data. And as far as we can do here, that seems to be the case. So just to conclude here, I'm just going to go into the opinion bit of what this seems to be suggesting is that, well, perhaps here we're getting these predictions that are fairly counterintuitive and suggest that we shouldn't be relying so much on verbal reasoning alone to make our predictions. And instead, we should be making more use of mathematical or computational models to make our predictions and see if that is actually what we see in nature. And as I mentioned, we have this sort of way to proceed, perhaps suggested by these, with 4 steps. And so far, actually, I just took 3 of them. So I just had one model where I picked trajectories and mechanistic predictions of those trajectories and tried to test those ideas with observed data as I described. But I didn't actually have more than one model, so I couldn't actually compare different models to see which model best explains the data. So that's something that I still haven't done that I would like to do in the future. And that means that because it's only a single model so far, that is only suggesting that that's a way that in which the human brain size could have evolved, not necessarily how it actually evolved. To be able to make that assertion, that we would at least have to compare more and hopefully a lot more models to try to make sort of more solid statement about why human brain expansion actually happened. And with that, I'd like to thank my co-authors, funding, and everyone here. Thanks for listening. Thank you very much.